Hey, good day to you all. It is Patrick Lovell, Truth Bomb riffing on Saturday, February 3rd, 2024 at approximately 11:45 a.m. my time. And once again, like everything, what I try to do with these truth bombs is it's kind of a part lecture, part sermon, part, trying to react to everything that's going on, to sequence what's on a lot of people's minds to the tune of millions, because we can see the views, we can see the reactions, we can see what people are talking about, and to fill in the blanks of what everybody's missing. And maybe in some ways it's part therapy for me because I've got this information that is excruciatingly challenging. And it's just like carrying the world on my back. And I'm trying desperately to penetrate the minds in the hearts of millions of good-meaning people out there, particularly good-meaning Americans out there that live by, virtue, live by integrity, live by courage, live by character, live by all of those things that we think of when we think of the American ideal in the midst of absolute lunacy, in the midst of chaos, things that continue to spiral out of control in every direction, that are a continuation and an expression and an extension of everything that I have been bringing to you now. And I think I'm up to like 453 truth bombs. But for the newly initiated, thank you for being here. If you find yourself agreeing with me and nodding your head, please like and subscribe. Most importantly, please share. I would also encourage you, if you're interested in joining me by the end of this truth bomb riff, to reach out to me, reach out to any of my colleagues. If you explore any of my truth bombs at Patrick Lovell Truth Bombs the Con on YouTube, and join us as quickly as possible. Because what we are attempting to do is the moonshot, which is a near impossibility. But of course, we know that nothing is impossible, but we have to at first inspire and create a critical mass of people that are using the information that I have to elevate this truth, this monumental truth, this intersection of everything truth, which is the ultimate truth that all other things are ultimately dependent upon. If we have a snowball's chance in hell to defeat what I call the Borg of tyranny, and quite frankly, misery. And to do so, you have to be able to turn off the volume on everything else once this thing turns on the switch in your mind and you realize Patrick Lovell is telling you exactly what's going on. And what's amazing about this is that I'm really nothing special. I'm not some genius. I'm not somebody with accolades that are, beyond the pale. I don't have several PhDs or a JD. I don't have 30 years in the public spotlight in a way that I've had project after project after project that people are like, oh, that's the guy that got it right on this particular situation, so I'm going to listen to him, and I've got tens of millions of followers. I don't. I think right now, and this is a good thing, I'm up to like 823 followers, subscribers on my truth bombs, which is an improvement. But the information I have should literally be on a daily basis consumed by tens of millions of people. I should have at least millions of followers to be able to do what we have to do to elevate it. And this is really the bottom line. It's not tricky from where I'm coming from. Everything else is tricky, okay? Because everything else is part of a deception racket that is meant to make sure you get further and further away from this truth that I am revealing to you, that again, nobody else will. And it's not because I'm a rocket scientist, okay? It's not because I'm some mad genius. It's because I'm the only one who's got the courage to actually say what needs to be said. There are many, many people that are aware of this information. They're just on the inside of the machine, or they're the ones that are using it to their advantage to everybody else's, again, misery. So where do I want to start? Well, let's just start again, and this is usually the purpose of these truth bombs, is to kind of tap into what everybody's talking about in the mainstream and also on online media and the reactionary scenarios that I call tools in the full circus, to be able to recalibrate what is that's taking you further and further away from what enables everything that we're in the midst of. So obviously, a lot of people are probably on the edge of their seat, one way or another, to see if there's going to be a broader conflict in the Middle East, which again is just a continuation of the last 21 years after 9/11, and quite frankly, decades before that, that led up to 9/11. But the current situation is that, of course, the United States did an incredible bombing mission yesterday using B 2 bombers that flew 13,000 miles round trip to hit targets in both Syria, I believe, in Yemen, and I'm not sure if they got some in Lebanon, but these were all targets that are what we call Iranian proxies, be they the Houthis or potentially Hezbollah, or maybe in this case, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing, monumentally confusing. But I heard, in a couple of sources that, yeah, maybe some ISIS targets as well, right? We haven't heard about ISIS, ironically, in the last few years, and ISIS is Sunni and attached to Saudi and Hezbollah, and I'm assuming, because I don't know this outright, but I'm assuming, given everything that's happened in Yemen the last many years, the Houthis are Shia, and this is part of a larger conflagration of this conflict that never seems to end between Sunni and Shia. But of course, there's the Israeli Hamas wider Palestinian conflict. And yeah, if you look at it, in terms of a sort of a global perspective, I mean, what have we seen for the last two, now going on 3 years? Well, of course, there's the theater in Ukraine, Russia having invaded Ukraine, and a NATO ally and everything that comes with that. And that is about, maybe flexing the muscle of the former Soviet empire, but it is resources, it is pipelines, it's everything that Ukraine is as a gateway to Western Europe, particularly for leverage and monopoly for natural gas pipelines for the Russians. And, then it's so much more than that, because, I mean, that conflict goes back centuries. And then, of course, we've got all things, Taiwan and China, which is another interesting geopolitical scenario that not only involves something that goes back again centuries, or most importantly, after the communist revolution in China, that all of their opponents retreated to Taiwan, but then Taiwan became this industrial powerhouse over decades. I remember growing up as a kid and seeing, many of my toy figures, particularly Godzilla and King Kong and that kind of thing, made in Taiwan. But so are chips, and there's been a lot of discussion about the United States reconfiguring our manufacturing sector and microchips and that sort of thing to bring back the opportunity, leverage that the manufacturing capacity in Taiwan has on obviously our technology engine and that sort of thing. But China would certainly like to have Taiwan back, and Russia is in the midst of trying to get Ukraine back, and probably will and can, especially if the West stops providing support. But the other part of the puzzle, of course, is what we're seeing. That's a continuation of the broader 20+ year conflict in the Middle East post 2001. And one thing I want to say to this is, I think the key, well, first of all, I want to address this. The nature of Hamas in Israel has gone back, quite a while, right? Since at least 2006. But Hamas is born out of the Muslim Brotherhood. That goes back decades, maybe even centuries to some degree, not so much in terms of the organization, but just sort of the mindset and all that kind of tribalism and everything that goes from Islam, yada, yada, yada. But the conflict on October 7th, it caught a lot of people by surprise. It didn't necessarily catch me by surprise, because I was expecting something that seemed inevitable because of everything that we've seen post 2006. I paid attention to pretty much everything that's happened in Israel for most of my life. And yes, I'm very well aware of Likud and Benjamin Netanyahu and outside big money influence, and of course, all of those things that would kind of undergird what we call the Abraham Accords, but particularly as it relates to, I would say, Israel becoming an indispensable nation in the Middle East, particularly for Saudi Arabia, who we've all seen post 9/11 because of its position as the world's swing producer, even though the United States is producing more oil and gas than anybody on earth. But it's still the swing producer. And oh, yeah, it's traded in American dollars really I think since at least Bretton Woods in 71-ish. I think that's really the kind of the turnaround. But the United States is the global reserve. Sorry, I said that in reverse. The global reserve currency that is dependent, quite frankly, on a lot of factors, but the commoditization of oil is a big key ingredient, in particular Saudi as a swing producer trading in dollars, which may or may not be it certainly appears to be going the way of leaving the dollar eventually because China is its biggest customer. And there's been discussion about the BRICS economies, which is Brazil and Russia and India and China and now Saudi. So it's BRICS plus one. And those are all countries that have a lot of natural resources. There are a lot of minerals, a lot of fossil fuel, of which the world is still dependent on a fossil fuel paradigm. And it has been since before World War II, but World War II was kind of, yeah, we are deeply, deeply embedded in fossil fuel paradigm, and we have been ever since. And then, of course, because of the global reserve currency being, weighted not in gold, but tethered to oil, there's a lot of things that happen in our so-called fiat currency that are dependent on that structure. And so if I'm really kind of taking a step back and I'm looking at all of this stuff from the geopolitical maneuverings of everything post 9/11, and I will say this, and I say this all the time vis-a-vis many of my truth bombs, but one of my biggest subjects that are one of the two things that I think we as a society have to solve now. It's 2024, guys. Most of these things that I'm revealing to you, we've known since the 70s. The 80s were another, maneuvering of things that I'll get into. But there is no time to waste. I know that millions of you don't understand climate change. You don't understand fossil fuels' role in the climate change, in the heating of the planet, and what that does to the planet and the ecosystem. Simply said, it is pretty much game over for life to exist on the planet, given where we're going, based on emissions, based on all of the stuff that happens from the oxidation of reefs to the bleaching of coral to the heating of the oceans to the melting of ice caps to a lot of things. No matter how you look at it, if it's an extinction level event, which would I believe be the seventh extinction of life on this planet, many of which can be attributed to carbon dioxide in studies that have happened throughout the history of the world. A lot of life has been wiped out as a result of a lot of volcanic activity that did many of the same kind of attributes, but I don't want to get into all of the details of, the science of it and everything else. Just suffice to say is that we have a global economy that is running on a poison that is one making the world unsustainable, but at the same time empowering and fueling this incredible disconnect between what I would call the modern pharaohs that are all in it. I mean, all of the oligarchs all around the world, you've heard that term over and over and over. What are they? They're kind of like cabals of organizations of powerful people in every country that extract wealth and put into this larger financial system, of which the United States has been both the receptacle and the it's interesting how these words are keeping up with my thoughts in my brain because I haven't actually tried to discuss this in the past, but there's this sort of equilibrium, right? Where when you have an economy, a global economy, you have to sum total of the produced goods into the global consumption, which is vis-a-vis all of these different variables, but that have to be financed. And they're ultimately financed by the global currency, which is the dollar, the global reserve currency, which is the dollar. We need finance. Finance is the lifeblood of any economy. Finance is the ability to take capital, money, to fuel growth, business development, any things that we might need for society, be it any category like energy, like agriculture, anything that we consume to survive, to create society and that sort of thing. And there are methodologies, depending on what part of the economy that we're talking about, that has different standards of being able to provide financial capital. Now, the way it works in the United States is that we have a final financial system that is made up primarily of the too big to fail banks that provide loans, whether they're consumer loans for houses, for cars, for college education, for starting a business. They provide loans based on underwriting standards that provide entrepreneurs capital to bring new verticals, be it new technology, be it agriculture, be it sporting goods, be it entertainment, it doesn't matter. But in all of these capacities, they all have a pattern, they all have a process, they all have models of which the entities that provide capital do so through a process called underwriting. And underwriting is to consider risk and upside. So when you provide financial uh, loans, lending, you do so for profit. So financialization is to make money from money. And the financial strata is made up of too big to fail banks that anchor the whole system. But then you have a variety of specialists that include asset managers, private equity, as well as hedge fund managers. And there's a variety of other sort of specialties like high end wealth management and so on and so forth that all basically use money to make money. And that's what fuels our economy. In the United States, we have a very rarefied position, although there's, I think, 7 other countries that are in the same capacity, but they're not quite at our level because of a lot of things, particularly resources and productive capacity, and of course, just military power. We are a superpower, or we were. We're now in the midst of falling in on ourselves, collapsing, very similar to the Roman Empire. I know many of you have probably heard of the Roman Empire and don't know the 1,000-year history of the Roman Empire, both its growth, its zenith, and then ultimately its downturn, and then what collapsed the Roman Empire. And of course, when you have 1,000 years of history, there's a lot of information there. But the United States, like all empires, is in the sort of death throes, I think, of a downward spiral that is collapsing in on itself. And I've predicted for some time, particularly in the aftermath of the October 7th event that's led to this incredibly tragic and horrific and yet very predictable for anyone who's known anything about what's happening in the arena outcome. For now, it's going to be interesting to see what comes next. But the one thing I didn't predict, which is what seemingly, actually, I kind of predicted it, but I didn't predict it at the same time. But it seems to be like we're a hair trigger away from something disastrous happening with a potential global war. Do I think Iran's going to try to push the United States into a situation where we have to go next level? I'm not sure. They haven't yet. I kind of thought that they would, I don't know, 2 months ago, but maybe we're getting closer to that now. And the outcome of that, I know it's just going to be more of the same. The one thing I'll say to those of you out there who consider yourself, emotionally attached to Hamas, or not Hamas, but the Palestinians' plight in this devastation and this tragedy of north of 20,000 people dying, being, many of you put in the category of genocide, which of course was it the ICJ, the International Court of Jurisprudence? Is that what that means? Anyway, they came down with their findings last week, but of course, yeah, for anybody looking at, I don't know, north of 18,000 children being, bombed, that's genocide. That's a problem. And I recognize that as which, and I understand all of the elements that are involved. But I'll just say, because some of you might be like, yeah, but Hamas. Yeah, Hamas has got to be eradicated. What comes next? I'll give you this quick antidote. Following 9/11, I had said, listen, if it's going to be all about oil, then why not the United States and Israel tag team and just take over Saudi Arabia? Because it was Saudi Arabia that got us on 9/11. Now, did Saudi Arabia plan it? Did they coordinate it? Did they execute it? Well, Al Qaeda did, but they couldn't have done, in my opinion, what actually happened without very high level assistance. And we do know that the CIA and the FBI knew exactly where the terrorist cells were. More importantly, they knew who was financing or providing, what do we call it, material support for the Al Qaeda, the Al Qaeda terror cells. And the CIA knew where they were training, and so did the FBI. And we knew they were up to something that models had predicted long before that. And miraculously, 19 hijackers with box cutters were able to take over 4 American airliners, and 2 flew into the Twin Towers, and 1 into the Pentagon, and 1 goes down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. All of that happened because the biggest intelligence apparatus on the planet with the most resources didn't see it coming. Now, I know it's 2024, and a lot of you people that are just now getting into your 20s, who were born at that time might be like, yeah, that was a long time ago. The United States didn't have that much technology like we do today. Oh, yeah, we did. I mean, we've been in the modern era of technology long before 2001. And this was like, flies. I mean, there was no way in hell, given with the information I just gave you, if we had somebody that was trying to thwart terrorism, not be able to do it. But the way the story goes is that, oh yeah, Dick Cheney didn't allow, and the Cheney Bush administration came in a little bit later, but all of it, all of the information that was coming from Wesley Clark, or not Wesley Clark, the guy Clark that was, what is his first name? Anyway, Clark, he was raising the red flag, immediate Al Qaeda attack, and not to mention Osama bin Laden had been on CNN and everything else prior to that, issuing an international fatwa, and that there was going to be a massive attack on the United States. And most of us at the time, at least the American public, were fixated on Monica Lewinsky. That's the American situation. And that plays into everything that I'm trying to reveal to you. But the long and the short of being able to express all of these things, when the Twin Towers came down, and immediately we went into this, this offensive sort of PR scenario in the UN based on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and there was this fog, and like nobody knew anything. And then there was this 9/11 commission that many people like Anderson Cooper and Rachel Maddow today in the mainstream media act as if that was the gold standard of an investigation, and kind of sets the tone. To give you an example, Senator Bob Graham, who was at the helm of the 9/11 commission, is all over the internet. Okay, all you have to do is plug in Bob Graham and 9/11, and you'll see that he's been talking for years about the failure of the 9/11 Commission report, what the Saudis' potential involvement was, how the United States government missed what they were supposed to do, kept 22 pages out of the 9/11 report that reveals much of what I'm telling you, and then ultimately, we end up going to war in Iraq. And Dick Cheney was the CEO of Halliburton, and Bush was connected all over the place to all things oil and all things, of course, military-industrial complex, which feeds into this global paradigm that I just, introduced to you a moment ago. And that's just the basics. So as you look at this theater of the, where we are in a potential, World War III scenario, just ask yourself, especially those that of you are either historians or people that have passing interest in history, at least modern history, ask yourself how insane all of this is in context to what we know happened, after Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, that triggered World War I and what that led to. And of course, World War I and World War II were a continuation, and then everything that happened afterwards is a continuation until now. And this is a continuation of everything else. And ultimately, what I'm trying to reveal to you is that President Biden issued this sort of statement, which is great fodder for the campaign and what we're in the midst of with this chaos between the lesser of two evil choices, that the United States is going to protect Americans at all costs, basically. That, the price of attacking America is real and large, okay? Meanwhile, since we're talking about terrorism, and that, builds our ire and our patriotism in many ways, and we all kind of fell for it back after 9/11, because we never went after the country that actually helped us foster 9/11. And yeah, there's a reason I say that. I don't want to get into all of the 9/11 conspiracy theories and everything else. What I provided you was factual evidence. And, everything happened since. But I can promise you that if the United States really cared about the American people, we certainly would be looking at a different situation post 9/11, and we'd be looking at a much different situation post the great financial crisis. The great financial crisis in 2008, of which I'm an expert in. I am an expert in it. And it's like I'm not a self-proclaimed expert. I'm a this is why I'm the only guy that's willing to bring this information to you and nobody else will. I am a producer, I'm a muckraking journalist, and I'm a guy that went the distance, that got the resources, that went to all of the right people to put together a bulletproof revelation of what created the 2008 great financial crisis and what happened in the aftermath. That work is on display and it's for free. And I'll just provide this caveat that we've provided it for free because the lights are blinking red and that all the American people buy are lies. And the American dream dies where power lies. And we all know that everything is a big lie. And we all know that you can't trust our institutions anymore. Most of you on the right can't trust deep state. Most of us that are people of humanity and culture and identity and that sort of thing, we can't, trust anything on the right. But for good measure. But I'll try to paint the picture this way, at least as it relates to the 2024. I can't believe it's 2024, but presidential campaign. And the way I look at it is it's the new Confederacy versus the new robber barons. More importantly, you can think of it as if Trump's campaign had sort of a platitude that was a catch-all, it'd be of, by, and for Trump at the expense of everybody else, where everybody's expendable. Because he's really just a front for right-wing billionaires, but they're kind of late Johnny-come-lately guys to Donald Trump. Donald Trump's always been Don the Con. Don the Con has always been caught up in the mafia. He has been since the beginning of his development days in Manhattan. And then, of course, what do you think is involved with casinos in New Jersey? I mean, my God, that's the Sopranos personified square. And yeah, Don's been in the midst of it the whole time. And oh yeah, by the way, real estate and casinos and restaurants are a place that the mob's been doing business for the history of the country and long before that. But he's also a front, and this is what Don the Con's always been about from where I'm sitting, especially since we saw him do last year unapologetically. And he is, to me, some cross between Benito Mussolini, but he's not even that, ambitious. He's not all about the far right state. He's not all about, the fatherland and all of those types of things. He's about himself, man. He's just this concoction that is the intersection is white. Okay, Fred Trump, his father was a KKK guy. Donald Trump has been unapologetically racist, even though a lot of African Americans have been, and this is the other part of America, right? We kind of mayonnaise this down, water all this stuff down. We put Donald Trump in a primetime network television show called The Apprentice for a very long time, where he's in prime time on one of the biggest networks in the United States. And it's all about, hey, let's see who can play this fun game about who's a real entrepreneur and whether or not Donald Trump's going to lay down the hammer and say, you're fired, really kind of kitschy and just cute, right? I mean, and then you had like these teams of celebrities and a lot of them African Americans. And yeah, they're playing ball with Trump. So he's kind of like, I don't know. He's a guy that we heard from Snoop Dogg recently. Yeah, Donald Trump never did me wrong, even though I've heard Donald Trump just roast the hell out of Donald Trump in the past and acknowledge, and he just did, by the way, that Donald Trump, yeah, is fond of pushing African Americans out of their house, and yeah, he was among other titans of real estate, of which he's not even a stone's throw from. I mean, he's so far from the Titans that did that, gargantuanly in a way that I've revealed to you. And again, my work, www.thecon.tv, that as I go through this sort of stream of consciousness and I'm rambling on, I want to close the point. The American dream, all the American people buy are lies, and the American dream dies where power lies. And that's all Donald Trump does. We know that We know he's north of 5,000 lies. He was impeached. So in addition to that, even though it wasn't voted on in the Senate because the Republicans are that corrupt, and of course, let me explain to you as we run through this, when Mitt Romney's the good guy, and above, like above the fray, there's a real problem with people's understanding of how things work in this country. But going back to Donald Trump in terms of who he works for, yeah, but he's also just a front to try to get pieces of Saudi Arabia and Putin, both of whom have been big clients of his for decades. And of course, it was the United Arab Emirates that provided his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, emergency lending so he didn't go bankrupt at 666 Park Avenue, one of his premier properties, which is his son-in-law, of course, married to Ivanka. And Ivanka was the front person on all of his, business dealings, and she gets a pass in this, Letitia James, New York AG's civil fraud trial that's about to reveal through Judge Ergeron, what the corporate, is it going to be a corporate death penalty? How many hundreds of millions of dollars is Donald Trump going to have to come up with? It might be north of 500 million, which means that he's going to have to leverage everything. And that means, is he going to be able to go bankrupt? And there's all sorts of weird stuff involved with that. But that's why Donald Trump is trying to run for president, as we all know, in addition to the 91 indictments, many of which are going to be criminal, including what we're seeing play out in the Supreme Court's going to bulldoze what the whole purpose of the, the constitutional amendment, 14th Amendment, Section 3, that of course Donald Trump successfully, through his relationship with the evangelicals, were able to get conservative judges backdoored into the Supreme Court to do the working of what? White right-wing billionaires that were the Johnny-come-latelys that are in addition to, of course, what I just laid out. And by the way, anybody goes, Russiagate, look, man, it's so simple. It's just stupid. And this is a message to Russell Brand and to Matt Taibbi and to Jimmy Dore and all of these other hustlers that are basically just punking everybody to be able to fit in this, circumference of clickbait for MAGA for all things Trump, because I think they're getting paid by the same system, including, most notably, Tucker Carlson. But the new Confederacy with the mob boss that's trying to get its piece at the table, and you want to think of it as for the new Confederacy to control the country for all of this, sort of what they call conservative ideology, but let's just do a shortcut, Jim Crow, and that sort of underbelly of the beast, of the devil in the shadows that's been there since the creation of the United States, where we've been fighting the idea of liberty and justice for all and bondage for some, which we've been fighting nonstop. And you cannot ignore the fact that we had a revolution. You can't ignore the fact that we had to create separation of powers and the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, everything that we're supposed to be, not to mention what we ended up doing in the Civil War. But of course, the battle never ends. The battle never ends. Yeah, we stood up big time against Hitler and fascism. And there's a lot to that. But it didn't get rid of white supremacy, obviously. And World War III is this situation where there's all this combustible, what do we call it when you're in an airplane and you're flying through turbulence, mass turbulence that could lead to just another massive wipeout, which we've seemingly been in the midst of for now over 23 years, which is, of course, it has been basically World War III, but it doesn't feel like it because most of the American people are just there. If you look back to Bush, where he said, hey, just keep spending, consume, consume, consume. Okay, well, how is the powerful American consumer class going to do that when we've offshored our jobs, where we've destroyed pensions, where we offshore accounts and made it very good for very, very rich people and very rich organizations, especially multinational corporations that just destroyed the middle class. But hey, okay, we're going to spend. Well, therein lies the whole eureka of what we all know and we all intuitively know and we all want to ignore because we're all kind of on the gerbil wheel and we're all feeding from the crack tube, most of us, not me, I can assure you. But I wish I was, by the way, in my own studio with a professional setting with, guys, working on my podcast, as opposed to me just doing a truth bomb riff, from my dining room. And, me trying to get your attention and me thinking in the back of my head while I'm talking, is this resonating? Can you get to the point, Patrick? These people have bandwidths like a squirrel, but you got to keep forging ahead, trying to get someone's attention, because of the information you have is the information that can turn all of what I'm about to tell you upside down and inside out, and most importantly, right side up, if you're tracking with me. I'm still just setting the table for what we're in the midst of. And to that point, many of you probably, if eventually I get millions of people to watch this, many people who are just finding me for the first time and just judging me what I look like and what I sound like, because that's what we do online. We just judge everybody. We don't really listen to what they're saying. We just want to say, they look like this, or maybe the guy's on cocaine because his nose is itching, and, whatever. The bottom line is, who is Patrick Lovell again? Well, I'm telling you that the 2024 presidential race is about Donald Trump of, by, and for himself through corruption, where everybody's expendable, for Don the Con to basically completely betray the United States and everything that we're supposed to be. But of course, he's a mid-level player, because when I use my comparison of the new Confederacy to the new robber barons, I'm not kidding. Because what is Biden? Well, Biden, in comparison, on sort of a surface level for me, is a much better choice than Donald Trump. But Biden is part of the system. And the system is what runs the Biden administration. And what is the system? Well, President Biden isn't of, by, and for the people, even though this latest proclamation that, you kill a few of our, military guys and you're going to feel the heat of the American empire, right? That wasn't the same thing that fostered everything post 9/11 through 2008 and so on and so forth. And quite frankly, many decades before that. But Biden's administration is of, for, and by BlackRock. Who's BlackRock? BlackRock is one of the three largest titans in asset management. Includes BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street, and there's a few others that run down from there. But they're one of the big financial sort of those guys in the arena, and they have a monopoly on a lot of things. And BlackRock's helmed by a CEO by the name of, it's so funny. I've got so many Wall Street names going through my head. I was about to say the CEO of Lehman Brothers, who's Dick Fold. What, you can't even make up that name, right? But Larry Fink is this guy's name. And you can't make up that. It's almost like a cartoon character. But Larry Fink's been around for a long time, and BlackRock and Blackstone were two power hitter finance companies that specialized in mortgage-backed securities prior to the 2008 Great Financial Crisis. There's something more for BlackRock in the midst of what we call the Aladdin technology, which is this, this tech that enables, BlackRock to see into the future through all of the data and know who's going to be on the up and down. And that's how they manage high wealth net assets. And that's how it became a very powerful company. But fewer people understand that Larry Fink was the guy who was in charge of what they call the Resolution Trust, which cleaned up the savings and loan crisis of the 80s. And that was part and parcel to what I'm about to reveal to you. So BlackRock, after the Great Financial Crisis, which was the 2008, many people refer to it as the 2008 subprime crisis. Others refer to it as the housing crisis. Others refer to it as the Great Financial Crisis. And those are all starting kind of pinpoint different pieces of what the financial crisis was. But it's, of course, what I delved into in my work called The Con, that we've made for free at www.thecon.tv, that reveals the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history that, oh, by the way, never ended. And ultimately, it gives you the blueprint of all of the different elements that took place in a ginormous assembly line of fraud, which we call racketeering. And oh yeah, the United States has remedies for racketeering and organized crime, as most of you know from TV shows. And most of you have heard the term RICO, which means racketeering influenced conspiracy organization. Racketeering influenced conspiracy organization, otherwise known as organized crime. So a lot of people in mainstream, because of all of the tectonic shifts and all of these horrible things that are happening, day to day in the media landscape, particularly what took place 2 days ago, where a mad man, self-proclaimed kind of white ring, shall we say, lumped into the MAGA universe, decided to murder his father, cut his head off vis-a-vis Al Qaeda slash ISIS, and put it on YouTube. And he made the proclamation that because his dad was a federal employee, he had betrayed the United States. And of course, because I think the inference was, even though I don't know if there was any factual basis for this, that I think that because there was a support for Biden, that he had betrayed his country. And so therefore, that's why this 33-year-old son murdered him. Okay, that's insane and it's sick, and we know that. And it's also fodder for the mainstream press in the frame of MSNBC and CNN and others that can run with the narrative that conspiracy is driving the world and the country mad, and might lead to something very, very horrific, i.e., what we just saw. And I heard, basically a lecture slash, sermon from Lawrence O'Donnell, which is just an op-ed the other day, which had merit and it was very compelling, but at the same time, it misses the broader point. And his whole point was that conspiracy is the problem, that there is no such thing as conspiracy. It's your mind going into places that you don't understand that drives you insane, which is a real danger. So you must be controlled. Now, meanwhile, everything that I'm revealing to you is obviously a conspiracy. And I laid out a truth bomb the other day that I entitled, okay, consider the word conspiracy and then consider the word organization and ask yourself, well, what's the difference between those two? Obviously, we can get into technical definitions, but now insert the word criminal. Criminal conspiracy in an organization is a criminal organization. And we have remedies to stop that, as you might imagine. So comparing a runaway train wreck, nauseating fool idiot that knows nothing about the world, who reacts, who wants attention, to murder his father horrifically, to, basically, I don't know, kind of learn from what we've seen for 20 years from Al Qaeda and ISIS, that, yeah, it's what we want to do is behead our enemies. Now, obviously, we have insane violence in the United States, but this was kind of a new spin on it, right? But what you have to wrap your head around is, yeah, there are massive, massive, massive conspiracies at work that control the whole system. Now, let me differentiate that from what the right is also trying to rain down because of the ramp up to the Super Bowl. That, of course, the success of Travis Kelce on the football field and his girlfriend, Taylor Swift, who has millions upon millions of fans, is some sort of hatched psyop to basically skew the election to Biden. And then, of course, the reaction for everybody who's, blue, no matter who, is all on Biden's side. And we as Americans respond to these types of things because, of course, we're all watching the Super Bowl because it's the biggest event that happens, that brings us all together in the United States. And many of us are true, genuine football fans. And many of us understand, quite frankly, that yes, there has been times in professional sports where players had an opportunity to do something, or a ref to throw a game to make an upside that maybe somebody behind the scenes was betting on in a Vegas casino. Yeah, I know firsthand of stories like that, particularly one of my former basketball players from Arizona State. When I went to Arizona State, got caught for doing that in a couple of games, basically missing points in critical situations and throwing games that they tracked back to a scheme for gambling. And yeah, he got caught. And again, that was a criminal conspiracy. And there's many, many more questions about that throughout the history. But one thing I can assure you is that you can't bet the house on anything in the NFL by way of conspiracy for an outcome. Even though, yes, I do acknowledge that it is possible for a ref to throw the game in certain circumstances. But that's different than an entire sort of kaleidoscope of what would have to come together to basically create a psyop to where the Kansas City Chiefs were going to miraculously get to their, what is this, their fifth Super Bowl in 6 years, something like that, I believe. And Travis Kelce, in the run up, I think tied, or maybe even, yeah, I think he tied the legendary All Pro greatest receiver in history, Jerry Rice, for all time catches in the playoffs. This is who Travis Kelce is. You don't make that up. You don't run that, through some sort of mechanism where everybody, we all watch the game. We all watch Travis make great catch after great catch. And anybody who knows the game of football or played the game of football, that's not something that you make up. I mean, it's ridiculous. And all of this stuff is so stupid. But again, it goes to this point that it's like, okay, the mainstream, can just laugh off these morons in our society. And yeah, they've gone off the rails crazy chain, and they might have some real problems. They might have some drug problems. Maybe they were buried in the 2008 great financial crisis, were on the street. Maybe they were homeless. Maybe they got involved with some sort of like hate group. There's all manner of shapes or forms. Maybe their family, just disappeared, and they've lived with hate and all sorts of these things, which I think we could probably think tens of millions of Americans are in that category. And they also are sick and tired of being lied to and made to be felt like the chump. But then again, they skew a lot of these people to a guy who's treating them like a chump. My nickname for Donald Trump is Chump Stain for so many reasons. I can't stand the man. I think he's the worst dude. And it's just the fact that he is somebody that's in this position, giving everything that's going on, is just so insane to me. But at the same time, it's like, God, it makes a lot of sense that he is because of what it is that I'm revealing to you. And so what we're seeing in the federal government's case against Donald Trump through the 91 indictments is simply this, particularly the civil fraud trial in Manhattan. And there's a reason it was in Manhattan instead of the Department of Justice. There's a reason why it wasn't a jury trial. There's a reason why it's civil, and that came from Alina Habba, the attorney for Donald Trump, not anyone else. That's why there wasn't a jury trial. But also, and there wasn't a criminal trial in the state of, but it's based on resources first and foremost. And it's also, if this thing was done correctly, in that particular case, the civil fraud trial, there's a lot of things that should have happened, particularly potentially at the Department of Justice. But instead, you've got this, Attorney General of the United States, who's this kind of softball guy that, supposedly is the real deal, who's not going to shake it up and, get involved with politics and that sort of thing and just be pure law. His name is Merrick Garland. Yeah, he dropped the ball mostly on all things Trump to push us into this massive conundrum that we're all in. But at the same time, with Jack Smith's investigations, which are very interesting, but also being held up, the biggest part of it, down in Judge Cannon's courtroom, where she's slow rolling this whole thing. And that's a part of her being assigned her position by the Trump administration and where her loyalties lie, which means corruption. But that's one piece of the puzzle. And the nature of the 91 indictments, if you were to frame the whole thing, and this is exactly what the federal government of the United States particularly said with the January 6th insurrection revelations, that Donald Trump defrauded the United States. He defrauded the United States by using documentation fraud, an electoral scheme to steal the presidency through the Electoral College, using a racketeering scheme that involved none other than Rudolph Giuliani, the basically godfather of the racketeering statutes. Because when he was a younger, more vibrant man on the side of good, he was in Manhattan as the New York DA that brought all of these charges against the 5 families, the crime bosses of the mafiocracy, the mob. And sorry, I didn't mean to say mafiocracy so soon. The mob in Manhattan, of which, of course, Donald Trump was a part of. And the only thing I can say about Giuliani, Count Dracula melting in front of everybody, alcoholic joker of a guy that got nailed with $148 million judgment for defaming, those in the Georgia election, that he's going to go bankrupt on, and nobody's thinking about Giuliani right now because front and center is the 84 million that Donald Trump is going to, fork over in addition to a potentially $500 million, vis-a-vis the case involving E. Jean Carroll and now in the civil fraud trial. But the 91 indictments through all of these vectors, through the Department of Justice, through the election, the election scheme, but ultimately in the in the classified documents down in Mar-a-Lago, and who might have Donald Trump be selling nuclear secrets to in terms of considering what we're seeing in the Middle East right now? Do you think Saudi Arabia would have shelled out a lot of money knowing what our nuclear capacity and strategy was towards Iran? Oh yeah, I would think so. And boy, that's front and center now. So let's not forget about that, even though Judge Cannon would like us to forget about that. But then we've got, not in addition to the racketeering, of course, is the racketeering case in Georgia, which is bringing all of these things that I just said about the electoral scheme involving documentation fraud. But now we've got a whole nother, problem because Fani Willis is such a moron. It's unbelievable. The DA in Georgia who was spearheading the racketeering, the RICO case against Trump, just is in the midst of this sexual scandal with one of her investigators that could have the whole thing thrown out. Oh my God, how stupid would you have to be? And I don't want to laugh because there's so much importance riding on it. But again, this is how stupid many people in government are. And trust me, whatever I wanted to, think about Fani Willis being on the right side of this, just went out the window. I think Fani Willis needs to go as quickly as possible. But then the other aspects, of course, we've got Alvin Bragg and the, illegal hush money payments to a porn star. And then whatever else. But I mean, really, the big one is Jack Smith's case about, oh yeah, and I guess he's going after the congressional Republicans that were involved with this, starting with Jim Jordan, and I think everybody's favorite horseface who looks like Mr. Ed, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and whoever else, the hundreds of Confederates that were involved with this. But the question that I always had, by the way, was, okay, so Donald Trump never organized anything in his life. And I think that the only thing he could have potentially came to the table with in terms of an original idea was, hey, back when I had Trump mortgages, there was this thing going around in the mortgage industry where everybody was lying on mortgage documents to get mortgages approved. Why don't we just white out the names of the electors in the electoral college and then place the ones on my ballot so that we can steal the election? It's the same thing. I could totally see him doing that. Nobody's asking this question. Meanwhile, by the way, this is what's so frustrating from where I'm sitting about the media, specifically those that have the capacity and have demonstrated that they could do it easily with the resources, but then spend it to the other side. So if you think of mainstream media right now, it's really just an extension of the power that's owned by billionaires that represents the duopoly. And Fox is all things the Republican Party and everything that comes with it since Trump. And then MSNBC is all things the Democratic Party. In fact, I'd say that Rachel Maddow is the communications director for the Democratic Party, which consider the source, considering what I'm telling you. And then CNN is just like, CNN's a joke. Not to mention, if we hit the quick rewind, only over a decade ago, it was CNN's president, Jerry Zucker, and then, of course, CBS's president, Les Moonves, who said out loud, oh, yeah, Trump is good for ratings. So they used this guy to become this ratings vector who was involved with international crime and racketeering to give legitimacy to that, provided him tens of millions of dollars of free advertising to keep him, in the mix so that he could ultimately become president to basically turn our country upside down and inside out. But the only reason that was possible was because of all of the failures that came before, most notably everything that's tied up in my work at www.thecon.tv that, reveals to you the failures of the Obama administration. And Obama was at the catbird seat of this whole thing, man. I mean, anybody who knows Obama, and I voted for Obama twice, and nobody ever got me more inspired, considering his beautiful oratory skills and his incredible intelligence and his athleticism and everything that he represented to me at the time. I thought he was like, literally, God came down from on high and found a guy that was the perfect answer for all the problems that we had been going through that led up to the 2008 great financial crisis, and then propped Obama up to create, a people's mandate, which was the same thing that happened in the aftermath of the Great Depression that led to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But instead of being a candidate of by and for the people, as it turns out, Obama was of by and for Wall Street, as was his first African American Attorney General of the United States, who came out of Covington and Burling, the law firm that basically is equidistant between the Federal Reserve and the White House. That basically was not basically, they were incredibly involved with what we call robo signing, and how the banks were transitioning from the registry of deeds to this digital sort of national composite to basically move what we call rights of assignments from houses that were being purchased into securities and move it on down. And so they wanted to get rid of, a stopgap measure that we'd had in this country over 200 years to basically ensure that if you own property, that the chain of title and everything that proves that you own that property can't be stolen from you from rich people, which is one of the reasons we had the United States to begin with, because that's exactly what the European model is, and that's exactly what aristocracy did to all of the tenant, what do we call all of the people that would live on the tenement farmers, but that's not what I'm talking about. All of the people that were basically just, slaves to the property of the aristocracy, the serfdom, right? I mean, that's what aristocracy was, and that's what presumably capitalism changed to basically help manifest the great American Revolution in entrepreneurship, and then integrity of law and separation of powers, where all of these things have to work in equilibrium, and power based on integrity, so that if you purchase something and you own something and you've fulfilled your duty to that debt, that's yours. Nobody can take that from you. But of course we did, to the tunes of tens of millions of people. So going back to this idea that President Biden is going to protect the American people from threats from abroad, how about domestic? Because I'd call this entirety of what I'm revealing to you financial terrorism. So I ended off with, all of these sorts of scenarios with the 91 indictments that essentially effectively prove through Donald Trump that everything that he is doing is illegal, but he's an expression of what I revealed to you that happened to tens of millions of people by way of our financial system that has complete control and ownership of our country, that conspired through racketeering, through all the methodologies of everything that we revealed to you, but primarily through two things that you have to try to plant inside your head. First, modern executive compensation. In the late 90s, we made it such that CEOs were incentivized to basically create risk so that they could have massive upside on a quarterly basis. But to do so, they followed the Jack Welch model that started in the early 80s of a lot of hyper competition, but ultimately they did so through what we call Gresham's dynamic. And Gresham's dynamic is a psychological mechanism to which everybody in the system of an organization has to play ball, because they know that there's a number they have to reach by any means necessary. So if you understand the business model of, let's say, I don't know, fill in your favorite idea, whether it's a sports franchise, whether it's a product like, I don't know, a football, whether it's a product like a car, whether it's a product like an airplane, everything has its business model. So in finance, the business model is that you make money through fees, mostly. It's a combination of these two things. Since the late 80s, we've had huge mega banks that have become investment banks because of the mergers that have taken place since the 80s, because we got rid of all of the laws that prevented all of this stuff from happening, because we learned the hard way that when you don't have these laws and regulations in place, the animal spirits of greed and fraud will overwhelm the system, that will lead to these types of scenarios, which were exactly what created the Great Depression. And it literally, by the numbers, created the Great Financial Crisis, which was a continuation of everything that started in the 80s, that led to the savings and loan crisis, that then led to the dot-com bubble, that then led to the Enron era frauds and WorldCom frauds. And they all have different elements of the same thing. But going back to banks and financial firms, they make money on fees many different ways, but primarily through mergers and acquisitions. And I'm going to put that aside because this isn't a topic of mergers and acquisitions. This is a topic of control fraud. You make money on the amount of loans that you make through fees that you then package and you slice and dice into securities and you move through a food chain that can ultimately become derivatives that then are bets on bets on bets. That's why many people refer to Wall Street as a casino or casino capitalism. But to pull all of this off, you have to have crony capitalism, which is corruption, which the profits. So you got to marry two things together. And I'm just going to introduce these two concepts at this stage of the conversation. Glass-Steagall, first and foremost, were the lessons that we learned after the Great Depression, were one of the greatest humans in history, one of the most courageous, most important people in history that I hope by the time, if millions of people begin to listen to me, that this name will become a household word. Ferdinand Pecora. Ferdinand Pecora was a prosecutor who was from Sicily, who came to the United States, who came up after he got a law degree, worked his ass off in this Anglo, monopolized legal profession of Manhattan to become this prosecutor in Manhattan. And he worked his way through Tammany Hall, which is, of course, the City Hall. And he didn't understand finance inside and out, but he understood grift and he understood the mob. And so he got this opportunity to basically find out what created the Great Depression, and he did, and it led to three significant situations. The first was Glass-Steagall. So we had, and those are names, these are bills that are written, co-written by guys on both sides of the aisle, Senator Glass, Senator Steagall, that created a situation where we separated commercial banking because we all need banking. You need a place to put your money. You need a place to withdraw your money. Over the course of the last 30 years, we've had technological innovations like the ATM, so you can get money whenever you need, and that money is guaranteed your deposits that you get from your job that you put in your bank account just in case something goes wrong with the management of the bank as a whole, which created the financial economy during the run-up to the Great Depression. We stopped that through FDIC insurance, which is Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, where every deposit is insured up to $250,000 supposedly. Of course, unless you're a big bank that deals in tech with a whole bunch of tech billionaires, then I guess they're going to, what we saw last year in three of the largest bankruptcies in history, where the federal government is going to insure banks' capitalization up to billions, of course, if you're a billionaire. But that's just part of the story and natural segue. But what we learned after the Great Depression was we separated commercial banking from investment banking. Look, capitalism does require risk. And the whole concept of financialization and capitalism is risk reward. So when I explain to you all of the dynamics of asset managers, of private equity firms, of hedge funds, of too big to fail banks and everything else, and consumer loans, and you've all heard about the Federal Reserve manages interest rates and also the amount of the money supply. And so those two things, the mandate of the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. And of course, everybody who is, on that side of the conversation are going to immediately jump to the book, the Jekyll Island, right? And, who created the Federal Reserve, which I can go into, and I think I will slightly, but it was created because there's been a battle in the United States from the very beginning, central bank versus democratization. And prior to the Federal Reserve, we had thousands of different currencies all over the United States. And we had many different economic swings, and we had all sorts of, scenarios where we ended up with monopolies and scams and all of these other things and robber barons and yada, yada, yada. And it got to the point where the swings were so huge that the financial system couldn't keep up with it. So they were like, we got to have a central bank to backstop all of the other banks, to backstop the growth of this incredible country that continues to have immigrants pouring in from Europe. And we had this huge industrial base, and we were just this ginormous, country. So we brought in a lot of the sort of old world sort of techniques and central banking that we had seen and we had learned ever since from the Revolution. And it was always a battle between Madison and Jefferson to begin with, whether or not we're going to have a central bank. By the time we get past all of these huge, upswings and downswings in the economy and massive depressions of the late 1900s and a run on currency and everything else, that the powers that be came together and they created the Federal Reserve, to where all of the major member banks pay in to ensure that they can capitalize and democratize the growth of the United States and do so by all the methodologies that we all anticipate is what you do in the lending process, i.e. underwriting, so that people who get loans to grow the economy are the right people that are going to do it in a way that are going to foment, the incredible stories that happen in the United States, be there Henry Ford and all of his flaws with anti-Semitism and everything else, but he mastered the technique of the assembly line more so than anybody else in the Industrial Revolution. And we could go into the Rockefellers and the growth of oil and everything else that came with that era that leads to, of course, the robber barons. And of course, at that time, Teddy Roosevelt ends up with trust busting because we had to have a country of by and for the people. And these are the swings and the shifts that have happened throughout the United States' history. So finance is about risk reward. Capitalism is about risk reward. And there's different variations of it. There's industrial capitalism that has a different model and financial capitalism that has a different model. But it all stems from the control and the techniques and the what they call the sort of the buttons that the Federal Reserve has to be able to, influence the economy, and that's always been the way it's been. But ultimately, because of finance and underwriting and all of the things that can either create a robust dynamism and growth model, or just the opposite. But it's become an illusion. Okay, it's all become an illusion because financial capitalism has relied on globalism. We've had a neoliberal international, global paradigm based on the fossil fuel paradigm since, let's call it, the 60s. I mean, it's really been post World War II. It was before that, but it all got centralized after World War II, because we were the last man standing. We were the most powerful country in the world. And we had atomic weapons, and we proved that we weren't afraid to use them. And that sent a message to the world, get on board. And yet the undergirding of all of that, there was another thing that took place that I think we all should be considerate of, okay? From the growth of the OSS, which was our intelligence operations during World War II, in the aftermath, we created the CIA. And the CIA is the international sort of arm of the American government to influence the world towards what our agenda is, our interests. And at that time period, it was created out of a law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell. And the Dulles brothers were most famous for their being involved with the Kennedy assassination Warren Commission. And that does play into all of this as well. But the purpose of the CIA post 2008 was, of course, this growth sort of scenario where the CIA worked with all sorts of allies throughout the world to be a bulwark to the communism and through the Cold War. And by doing so, what they did was a lot of times they worked with hard right, mafiocracy or mob bosses in countries like, Italy primarily, throughout Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And then also, with a lot of, shall we say, neo-fascist type of operators that were standing in the aftermath of the Cold War. But we did that as a bulwark to Stalin, the Soviet Union, and all things that became the Cold War. That was the purpose of the CIA. And the CIA got seemingly more and more powerful throughout. But what's interesting about bringing up Sullivan and Cromwell, as well as I talked about Eric Holder's Covington and Burling earlier. For those of you who think about power and conspiracy and who's in control, I think a lot of you kind of look at the guys in suits, the guys who are powerful people that you see kind of engage with politicians, or maybe on television or behind the scenes, or maybe you see in business or whatever. There's all of these different types of groups that are involved, particularly big four accounting firms and big white shoe law firms and so on and so forth. Those are all kind of the sort of vertical, the organization. Remember what I said about conspiracy versus organization, and insert the word criminal? Well, as it turns out, the entirety of what we learned when I created the 2000, I had to go figure all of this stuff out. I had to turn my mind inside and out, because prior to the 2008 great financial crisis, I thought that the country, the greatest country in the history of the world, operated, quite frankly, by the way I looked at systems that I grew up with, particularly football, right? Football has a system. It's a meritocracy. The best get a position to play on the field. Those that are the best on the field throughout a season might go to the next level, be named, let's say on a, all state, and then they move up to college and so on and so forth. So it's the meritocracy that rewards those that are the best, that put in the most effort, that are the best players, that do the righteous grind to get there, that eventually, achieve glory at the top. I kind of looked at everything else in the United States, whether it was Hollywood, whether it was finance, whether it was government, whether it was, all things technology and medicine, that the best get to the top. And they get there based on their own meritocracy because they played the game of whatever their vertical was the way it was supposed to be played, and they were the best at it. So therefore, they achieved the most. The 2008 great financial crisis unfortunately forced me, because of my own experience, to have to recontextualize my complete understanding of the system that we're in the midst of. And what I did when we made the con, and why I'm the only guy that can reveal this information to you if you're still tuning in, and I hope I've carried your interest long enough, and I keep thinking to myself halfway through this, should I just give up and say, this is stupid, nobody's going to watch it? Or should I finish my, like I said, my lecture or my sermon or my own therapy? And I'm like, screw it. I'm the only one who's going to give this information. So it's got to get through and it's got to penetrate one way or the other. And what I'm telling you is that there was a fraud mechanism every step of the way built through controlled fraud, because the banks are incentivized through modern executive compensation to reach a number on a quarterly basis through incentives that are going to enrich the board and the CEO more than anybody else in the company, and then shareholders also, but based on the amount of volume of loans that these banks are doing. And as it turned out, the banks, through this pipeline, this assembly line of how things are put together, got rid of the rules and regulations that make everything safe and make everything what it is, so that everything can be what we would expect. And the time period that I grew up in, particularly the 70s, when you look at neighborhoods and you're in a middle class neighborhood or an upper middle class neighborhood and a rich neighborhood, that those houses have value. That's real. And that's true because there's ways that those things happen, particularly as you come down the paradigm of the economic structure to the middle class, that we used to have a vibrant middle class, at least much more so than now, that could afford their homes, put value in their homes, live in their homes, that created what put the appraisal value of those homes that was real. But because of these incentives and because of what we call financialization, and financialization is money making money on money, that these guys created all sorts of schemes to be able to get the facade of people approved for loans, to make it look like the economy was pumping and churning, that people were buying new houses, that that's a reflection of the broader economy as a whole, to make the board of directors and the CEO very rich, that grabs a lot of headlines because a lot of people want to invest in those companies so that they can get a piece of the upside. That's kind of the idea of the nature of our economic model. But what they were doing was they were using, through sort of plausible deniability, through this chain, they basically turned everything upside down, inside out. And what they did was they'd get brokers that were just hustlers, street hustlers, to lie, deny, switch the blame, implicate. I just went with that because that's what the Trump model is. And this is where Trump learned all of this stuff. But they lied on documentation fraud to get loans approved. And the only guys that got, incentivized and bonuses and moved up in the system and became managers and that sort of thing were the people that were really, really good and willing to lie and hide and cheat and steal and do everything they could to get their clients into a house, no matter what, because the way the system was weighted was that the investment banks were creating warehouse lines to what we call pretender lenders that were using these fake originators to basically get people into loans that they should never have been put into, by using all sorts of deceptive acts and practices, by the way, which are all illegal. And each one of these types of situations, when you white out somebody's documentation on their W-2s to show that they're making more money, or that their cars are worth more money than they are, or that they have more income that they do, all of these are felonies. And if you get caught for doing that, you go to jail for a long time and you get kicked out of the business. Those are some of the remedies that happen at every level of where there's supposed to be some sort of professionalism in the situation. That goes for what's next in the pipeline, because it goes for the originators to the underwriters. The underwriters are the ones from the lending institutions that are going to approve the loans, because they got to do the due diligence to be able to determine whether or not those people who are applying for a loan can afford it. But if the originators are lying on the loans and the originators know they're lying on the loans, what we found was in our work that they were incentivized to just rubber stamp the loans, because their managers wanted the volume and that's what they were getting paid to do. So they'd force the underwriters to just do like the easiest thing possible, just approve the loan. Call it in, approve it, do whatever you got to do to approve it. Even if you see red flags all over it, doesn't matter. Your job is dependent on the amount of loans and you've got to approve the loan. That's what they were doing ad nauseum. Then the other side of it is the appraiser. The appraiser is the one who gives the value of the house. Appraisers have to work within what's known as UDAP codes. UDAP. I'm forgetting the actual abbreviation of what the professional standards are of accounting practices as well as appraisal practices. And I'm sorry, I forget the name of it because it's right on the tip of my tongue, but it'll come back to me in a minute. But they were incentivized to lie about the appraisals to give it a higher value, because the entirety of the system was predicated on refinancing, what we call a rolling loan knows no loss, all stemming from the CEOs through control fraud to get as many loans approved as possible so that they could, get their bonus. That's really what it comes down to. And they use Gresham's dynamic and incentivize through perverse incentives to have all of these lies in the pipeline, so far as at origination to appraisal to underwriting, that it also included the lending firms. And then if you go up the food chain, the next realm is what we call credit rating agencies. The credit rating agencies, some of you may have heard of like Moody's, which is owned by everybody's favorite. I think of the Nebraska, why can't I think of that Happy Days, character that Ron Howard played? He kind of reminds me of Warren Buffett, but he owned Moody's, and Moody's was incentivized to do what the underwriters were doing. If you ever saw the Big Short, they had a scene where the underwriter was literally answering questions of the investment bankers, trying to figure out if there was something going on that they should be aware of that they could short against, which the person at the rating agency had sunglasses on, as in see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. And right then, that's when, in the Big Short, they knew they had to short against the actual housing market because of all of these techniques that were involved. And I can assure you that the Big Short got most of it wrong, got a lot of it right in the last 5 minutes, was a great film nevertheless. But what I do in the con at www.thecon.tv is give you all of these elements and then some that created this disaster, but that ultimately leads to what the ultimate revelation is, that is undergirding this entire system, that you must pull the curtains back of your mind and understand, if you're going to understand the country that you live in and the reality of our times, that's leading to potentially Armageddon in World War III, or some sort of something that's going to come and blindside you through an economic upheaval at some point. And if you haven't lived through one yourself, trust me, it's not a fun thing to go through. So I ended up at the credit rating agencies because the credit rating agencies had to provide AAA stamping. AAA, it had to pass their critical, process to be able to sell to pensions around the world and sovereign wealth funds and everything else. That Wall Street was bundling tens of thousands of securities through these, liar's loans. Seriously, they called them liar's loans or ninja loans. Ninja loans are called no income, no asset. We were giving houses away to people who were lying, stealing, and cheating and turning a profit out of nowhere, out of thin air, because they could, because there was tens of trillions of dollars being invested through warehouse lines into this housing market, because it was all fueled by the Federal Reserve, who lowered interest rates so high to ramp up the housing industry in the wake of 9/11. And that was when George Bush said, look, you don't need to go to war. You need to spend, 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 spend. I remember at the time I was thinking to myself, God, I hope somebody knows what they're doing, because I had huge credit lines at the time, but I was making big money at the time too. But it was like, wait a second, what happens if my job goes sideways? Because I was spending most of what I was making. And yeah, man, that's what most of you are doing today. Okay. And so what happened in 2008 is we created a $4.6 trillion housing market, and we created a 600 to $800 trillion derivatives market from it. Many of you may have heard of the terms credit default swaps or overnight, what are they called? The overnight, it's part of derivatives and everything else, but it's the mechanics of all of what Senator Byron Dorgan, who was one of the longest, and I think the longest serving senator in the history of Congress, told me straight up that it was just sawdust. It was sawdust being sold as a myth, and everybody was in on it. And why? Because everybody was getting fees. So it created the largest criminal conspiracy and cover up in history. The conspiracy itself was literally tens of millions of felonies that undergirded the whole thing, which was deceptive acts and practices. And now remember, I told you that Donald Trump is being laid up by the United States government as having used deceptive acts and practices to defraud the United States. But Wall Street's not guilty of that, but they are. And here's the other caveat to that. So we created this $800 trillion derivatives madness, and then all of a sudden, all of the banks were illiquid. Things went sideways when the borrowers didn't pay on their mortgages, and then things started going sideways into foreclosure. Then it created this incredible avalanche of just misery. And ultimately, the way that affected up markets is there was no liquidity in the system. What is liquidity? It's capital. And so when the banks started going bankrupt, they couldn't lend. They couldn't lend to real businesses that were out, doing what they do. All of the businesses in the real economy, whether they were, supermarkets and agriculture and farms or shipping or, energy or transportation or any of the rest of it, none of those businesses could get capital because the banks had basically given themselves cancer with all of these toxic assets. And then suddenly they were like, okay, the whole global system came to a complete standstill because the system has to operate with liquidity. That's the lifeblood of the global financial system. But as it turns out, the guys as the middlemen who have absolute control of the financial system are doing these techniques that I'm telling you. Now, that was in the too big to fail banks. So that's Chase, that's Wells Fargo, that's Bank of America, that it became Goldman Sachs because of what took place in the aftermath of the great financial crisis. They were an investment bank, but then they became a bank holding company, which makes them a commercial bank, which is like all of this stuff to capitalists, quite frankly, is like an abomination. It's like talking to somebody who's a pure Christian and then finding out their priest is raping their daughter. I mean, it's that sort of abomination. And some of the technology or terminology that we would use at that time was like moral hazard. Moral hazard. Okay. So I want you to consider this as kind of a catch-all, right? So when you hear moral hazard in the financial sort of arena, I want you to think of a lot of you, particularly MAGAs out there, and I doubt very seriously that any MAGA is still hanging on listening to this, but they're anti-communist, they're anti-socialist because they've been born and bred that we're anti-communist and anti-socialist, right? But as it turns out, they're supporting socialism. That's the whole point. So what happened in the aftermath of the great financial crisis through moral hazard is that, look, Wall Street was like, it pointed a gun to its head and it said, basically hold me accountable, stop me and hold me accountable, and I'll shoot. It was like, okay, I'm too big to fail. I'm a systemically important financial institution that's got my fingers in every aspect of the economy, be it financing public schools and states, to the military, to everything that we are. And yet they played roulette with everybody else and did it for fees and did it for the upside for the CEOs who are the dons in this whole business through illegal acts and practices that are deceptive acts and practices that are literally, some will argue, like President Obama did, yeah, but they didn't break the law. There's a caveat that there's a part of it that may or may not be along those lines, but at the end of the day, all the civil rights laws are, you can't lie on documents. You can't do documentation fraud. You can't lie to your client. You can't set up something that's not real. And if you get caught, Those are all felonies. Again, deceptive acts and practices. And the way it works in finance is the way it works in the way we sell securities to investors is that you have prospectus that lay out what's going on, and you've got to prevent factual information. And if you get caught lying, stealing, and cheating, as you might imagine, like if you were in high school and you get caught lying on your test and you're cheating, you're done. But that didn't happen in the great financial crisis. What we did was we used the power of what we were able to obtain through the sacrifice of everything that we were to become the United States, to become the superpower, to become the nuclear armed atomic power, this superpower that basically rebuilt the world after we won World War II with our allies and, of course, the Soviet Union against fascism. But we were the go-to because we had this industrial powerhouse and capitalism was more efficient, but we had laws and we had character and we had people who did, quite frankly, believe in the afterlife, in God's wrath. And we did believe that do right and wrong. And the character of the United States was more good than evil. You're always going to have evil, but that's why you have the law. That's why you have regulation. You regulate evil. You throw it in jail. You hold it accountable. You don't let it take over your entire system like a cancer. What do you do to cancer? You have chemo, which destroys the whole body, and you poison the poison is what chemo is. Regulation is you hold crime to account. So going back to the beginning of this lecture, truth bomb therapy session, lecture, like I said, sermon therapy section, therapy session is what's the difference between conspiracy, organization, especially if you insert the word criminal. Now, none of this is hypothetical. None of this is hyperbole. None of this is conspiracy theory. What I am revealing to you are the facts. And that's evidence. As we all know, in murder investigations, you present the emails and the actions that preceded in the murder weapon and the evidence, and all of these things meet the threshold of the four elements of a prosecution through mens rea, actus rea, and the other elements, I guess it was motive and intent, that ultimately prove guilt in a court of law. And if you have integrity of the law, then all of this stuff is held to account. But what happened was, and this is the reason I had to make the con, was because I knew there was something wrong in Dodge. I knew they were pissing on my head, telling me it was rain. I knew they must have thought I was some kind of new fool. Why? Because I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a business guy. I've been around. I've seen things. I know things, whatever. So I just started asking the questions. And then I found the resources. And then I went and put it all together. And I put together what the $90 billion apparatus of the Department of Justice, the Federal Reserve, the DOJ, the SEC, AGs around the country, and so forth, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, didn't do. Yeah. And I didn't do it with a $90 billion budget. I did it for $4 million, $4.5 million roughly. I don't know what the full figure is, and there's a reason why I don't know that, but it's approximately that. And ultimately, we got so much more. But what I'm getting at is in the aftermath of the 2008 great financial crisis, because the entire world seized up because they all trade through liquidity based on the central banks of the United States and the world, because the dollar is the reserve currency for this entire global paradigm, and that everything requires finance. We pumped tens of trillions of dollars into the system that destroyed us, and we never held them accountable. And by the way, if you want another piece of evidence that proves all of that, there's many, and I'll put all of this stuff in the description downstream, but there were civil fines and judgments in all of the major too big to fail banks that landed in 2016. That included Bank of America for 16 billion. Chase was like 13 billion. Bank of America, or I said Wells Fargo, was slightly less than that. Goldman Sachs was their fine was 5 billion. I remember that, but they were all fined. And if you read the actual decisions, the DOJ says everything that I'm telling you. And in fact, the DOJ laid everything out in what we call the Federal Crisis, not the DOJ, the Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission gave all of this information as well. but it was a precursor. It should have gone to Congress, and it should have been, based on that information, did the deep dive that would ultimately hold all of the CEOs on Wall Street accountable for racketeering, just like they're doing with Donald Trump right now. Okay? But they didn't do that because their jobs depend on it. So does everybody else's in the hierarchy. And they're like, hey, you know what doesn't matter are stupid Americans that got involved with this to the tune of tens of millions of people. And by the way, it wasn't just people who got into the housing situation. It were people in pensions that they lost all of their pensions, which many of whom are the white working class who support Trump. And oh yeah, Trump would have definitely done the same if he had the opportunity, and probably did. But he's a private guy. He's a small level guy. He never sold the pensions. But the long and the short of it is that pensioners are the other side of this. So the griftopia that destroyed the world targeted minorities that didn't know what was going on and destroyed all the wealth accumulation that they did after all of these horrific laws that we had post Jim Crow and the Civil War that prevented African Americans from getting a piece of the American dream through redlining and other things. But there was gains by African Americans that all just dissipated in the 2008 great financial crisis. When they got the American dream, it became their American nightmare. And you'll see that in the con infinitum. And, where do I want to exit out of this? I mean, I could talk for 5 hours on this thing, and I know nobody's going to listen to this, but I don't care. I don't care because I got to lay it out there. One day somebody's going to discover it and they're going to be like, my God, why wasn't anybody listening to this guy? Because in the aftermath of all of the stuff that took place, and this is now 13 to 15 years ago, that's the time span, that ultimately led to the Federal Reserve having 98 secret meetings, many of which would involve the Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission later downstream that would interview such people as a guy by the name of Roger Cohen, who happened to be one of the main partners of an operation at a law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell. Do you remember me mentioning Sullivan and Cromwell earlier in this dialogue? They're the ones who created the CIA. So he just happens to be the go-to guy that's working with all of what they called, I kid you not, he literally calls it the consortium of the too big to fail banks with the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve was basically at that time, in all of these things that were happening behind the scenes, were at this point, and you can't make this up either, a guy by the name of Ben Bernanke, who would go on to get the Nobel in economics for this activity that destroyed tens of millions of people. There's a lot of things there that you can read between the lines. And then there was Hank Paulson. Hank Paulson was the former Secretary of the Treasury during Bush, but he was a former CEO of Goldman, just like his predecessor, who was the former Secretary of the Treasury for President Clinton, who came out of Goldman Sachs. He was the CEO of Goldman Sachs as well. And then ultimately, these guys, and Timothy Geithner, who was the president of the Federal Reserve of New York, who was supposed to regulate all of Wall Street, who never did. He was a complete buffoon, idiot, just yes man, who was basically sniffing the jockstrap of guys like Alan Greenspan, who made all of this possible, who really was no threat to anybody. He could never do anything. He became the Secretary of the Treasury under President Obama. And he said out loud, I shit you not, at this time period, look, we've got a plan to figure this whole thing out. The American people are going to be foam on the runway for the crashing financial system. And then, of course, at the same time, Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson would say in all of the business press, oh, yeah, we've got the bazooka. Don't worry about it, markets. Don't get ratchety. Don't run from the markets. We've got you covered. And the way they did that was they sold the American people that they were providing $750 billion in liquidity through an act of Congress that moved heaven and hell, supposedly, to get rid of all of the other things that they were fighting about, like we know happens in Congress, to do something for the American people. And they sold it as TARP, the Troubled Assets Relief Program, to provide liquidity to the banks, which ultimately there was a sidebar that said, oh yeah, within TARP, that they're going to buy the toxic assets off of the books of the banks so that the banks could start lending again. What that meant was it started this thing called quantitative easing, which economists will tell you is low interest rates for a long time, basically free money to pump the markets. But what they were literally doing was buying the financial flows of all of the toxic assets to make the banks whole that supposedly went on the bank. They did go on the books of the Federal Reserve, which can hold it infinitum. Why? Because we're a fiat currency. Because we're a fiat currency where the Federal Reserve can just digitize money into thin air. And what it did, instead of provide through Congress, which has the power of the purse. And there's a difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy. But the fiscal policy is how the government operates. And yeah, they can spend whatever they want on anything. For a global war, for example, oh yeah, they can fund that as long as they need to. How about infrastructure projects? Oh, let's fight about that. And whoever's in control of Congress because of the federal debt and all of the sorts of stuff that's tied to what I'm telling you. But what we provided was hang on to your seats, okay? Hang on to your butts. We didn't provide $750 billion through Congress that solved the issue. We provided 33 trillion. There's 1,000 billion and a trillion of dollars immediately through all of these emergency lending apparatuses with different terms and all sorts of different sorts of scenarios through the financial system to basically get the toxic assets that everybody was lying on to get a fee so that the CEOs could, run roughshod on the world and destroy the global economy. And then ultimately we gave them trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars, which they stuck into their bonuses, by the way. And then they just doubled down and tripled down and did the same thing. And we've been doing the same thing for the last 13 to 15 years. Slightly different depending on what sort of part of the economy we're talking about. We could be talking about commercial real estate. We could talk about, all sorts of, private equity. But ultimately, and I wanted to talk about this. This was going to be, the subject of my truth bomb today. But I'm going to have to finish off with this. So, but what they did was this was all illegal because we have what's known as Federal Reserve Act 13.3, which can be put into motion based on the lender of last resort capacity of the Federal Reserve in times of crisis. And it says right there in the statutes that you do not lend trillions of dollars. It doesn't say trillions of dollars, but it says you do not provide emergency liquidity to bankrupt, institutions who are insolvent because their collateral is worth nothing. That's in the statutes. That's the whole purpose. You can't loan against a fraudulent operation that got that way based on everything that I've told you this. But that's exactly what we did. And that's what the media is not telling you. That's what all of Congress isn't telling you. That's what we've been living through for the last 13 to 15 years. That's what has us in a situation where people are complaining. They're out of their minds, murdering parents and, cutting their heads off, talking about, traitors to the Constitution or to the Republic kind of thing, when it's like they have no idea. They can't see the forest for the trees because of just this insanity of ignorance that exists. But that ignorance is boiling into madness. And that madness will erupt into insanity. And so one of the things that could possibly cause that to go sideways is a global pandemic. Oh, we actually already did that. What about a third war? Yeah. I mean, this is the thing that we've been living in ever since. I don't know what the end game is. But I can tell you right now, it's massive, massive, massive racketeering, which means it's illegal, which means that our system is a criminal syndicate. This is what Lawrence O'Donnell, who works for MSNBC, who is a vector, a mouthpiece, for the revolving door meritocracy of the Wall Street Democratic Party, and Rachel Maddow is the spokesperson of. And then Donald Trump is just trying to get a peace with all of his guys because it's like, okay, does Saudi want influence of the Federal Reserve? Yeah, probably wouldn't be a bad thing for them. Putin actually became Putin because of all the stuff that preceded all of this stuff with what's known as long-term capital management and the derivatives that blew up the Russian ruble back in the late 90s that led to the mafiocracy of Russia. Russia's not a communist state. It's a mob state. And that's what we are. That's what we've become. That's what I'm telling you. So the idea that this is a battle to save democracy is ludicrous. Remember, it's the new Confederacy versus the new robber barons. It's Donald Trump of by and for himself to exploit and destroy everybody else as a front for our enemies. And it's, President Biden, nice enough guy, all things considered, who's part of the machine, who has been part of the machine for 4 or 5 decades, and then ultimately is of by and for BlackRock. And so when the Federal Reserve provided tens of trillions of dollars of liquidity illegally to all of these systems, it had to have an operation that actually knew how to do this and mop it up and do everything the way it needed to be done. That was called BlackRock. Yeah, they're the ones who manage all of the emergency facilities to pick the winners and losers in society. That included all of the major media brands, by the way, of which I'm dependent on to get this information to you, and why we couldn't get it on HBO because we got sabotaged by the machine, and why I've got to bring the truth to you directly because all the American people buys or lies. So we made the truth available to set it free so that power can no longer get away. Let's see, power thrives. Anyway, I can't think of I've gone on for so long here. It's incredible. Thank you if you've listened to this whole thing. It's a mess. It's a real fucking mess. And look, what I'm offering you guys, because I have all the answers and then some. I'm the only one willing to say this, but I've got to build an army. I've got to build a people that believe in life, liberty, and justice for all, that believe in the integrity of law, that have to get the control of the country back of, by, and for the people the way it was designed, with separation of powers in the Constitution. Is it perfect? No, but it's the best thing in history, and we can make it even better. And I need you to understand that we've spent 70 trillion to this apparatus, and we're about to spend trillions of more because we still got the same problems. Even though the Biden administration says that the economy is doing so great, it's all horseshit. They can lie with the CP lie is what they talk about. Yeah, people have more jobs and they're getting more money, but inflation and at least housing and fuel came down big time. I do have to give the Biden administration that. Fuel is down big time, but the problem there is that we still have this dependence on fossil fuel. And so ultimately what we have is, to compare apples to apples, you have $70 trillion that was thrown through monetary policy, not fiscal policy, but through monetary policy, through all these jagoffs to basically steal and loot and destroy the United States and the American dream and betray us all. And it's not just Donald Trump. He's just a small player trying to get his piece because he's a scumbag. I'm talking about the titans of Wall Street who run this country, but most importantly, private equity. Private equity couldn't survive a day without the infusion of the capital from the financial flows of the Federal Reserve. And what I'm telling you is, this is socialism. This is socialism that props all this stuff up for the middle guys that are playing everybody, that have destroyed and betrayed everybody, and nobody knows what's going on. We've got to hold these people to account. We've got to purge the madness. We've got to purge corruption. I'm leading a tidal wave populist crusade to purge corruption, because corruption births and fuels fascism. I'm an American. I believe in liberty and justice for all, the principles of the Constitution. I believe in a dynamic, fair playing field of equality where the best of us rise to the top, and there has to be incentive for that in all categories. However, there has to be a safety net, and there has to be a valve to where those who fall through the cracks have an opportunity to bounce, get into the next game. But see, guys, we need everybody, just like the works projects of what happened after the Great Depression, where we rebuilt the infrastructure of the United States, and after the World War II with all the returning GIs that built a highway infrastructure system that basically gave monumental growth to the United States, not to mention our industrial capacity. We can do all of that again by rebuilding the paradigm of the United States, starting with getting off of fossil fuel into a renewable energy paradigm. So when people start to talk about costs, when they talk about problems, they talk about this and that, just imagine the last 50 years, just imagine the last 23 years, just imagine what's next, because of everything that this system has been living on, far past the time it should have died. And it died in 2008. But it's just been a facade ever since because of the way what I just laid out to you. So we've got to consider two things. We've got to get a president in the White House that can actually use the bully pulpit of the presidency to force the issue of everything that I'm saying, because I've already done the work. I've already got all the people that can bring this to fruition. But that if we could get this with 70 million people, 80 million people, 90 million, 100 million people behind us, that we could force Congress to basically reveal everything that we've got. We can, I don't think there's a statute of limitations on fraud, but we've got to break up the criminal racket. I could go into detail about every single one of them that are there, but I've already talked about 2 hours, I think, as it is. But if we do that, and we create a modern day Pecora situation where we break up the investment banks that are being part of the commercial banks, where we create aligned interests, where we actually have a law of by and for the people that holds the bad guys to account so that they can't steal from everybody, and then make this proclamation that, the American people matter, while we have tens of millions of people that suffered through, homelessness, or millions of people at least, collateral damage like divorces, and all the stuff that happened from suicides and everything else. I mean, that's terrorism. That's financial terrorism. And our financial system waged that on the American people. I want to fight them like President Biden is saying we're going to take on Iran as a result of all of these other, scenarios that have been going on for the last 20 years to prop up the fossil fuel energy paradigm. And you've got to understand that $70 trillion should be the starting point of your concept of what we do to build a new productive economy. And by the way, I think we'd get rid of the national debt like that. An honest system is why everybody around the world invested us in the first place, and we got to rebuild the world. I shit you not, because over the course of the last 20 years, all we did, and this is my ultimate sort of critique of the BRIC states, even though they, if they create their own currency to kind of challenge the US hegemony and that sort of thing, they're all ridiculously corrupt. Do they have resources? Yeah, but they're all insanely corrupt. We went towards them versus them coming towards us. The America that I know and love is an America of decency, of an integrity, but a vicious freaking payback to evil. That's what I think the United States is. That's what we've always been. And so what I'm doing in this whole situation is you've got to frame it like this. Look, I'm trying to lead exodus against corruption to create the redemption or the resurrection of the American dream. Sorry to use the biblical sort of references, but I mean, come on, it works. And the long and the short of it is that if you, me, and everybody you see who isn't a Nazi, that believes in decency and dignity and integrity and sustainability and beauty, right? And ultimately, all of those things that make that side of our population what it is, the creators of this country, the producers, quite frankly, of this country, if we all merge in unity and we come out of our silos, then we will purge the misery of tyranny, and that's our destiny. And that's what I call the clean New Deal. There's no time to lose. Time is running out of the hourglass. And you know what? I'm on the side of Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift, and I would love to see them get married after a Super Bowl victory. Boy, would that be a Cinderella ending. And my son brought that up to me the other day, and boy, would that be cool. But in the meantime, think about it, America. What would you do if the Super Bowl was rigged? What would you do if the thing that we celebrate in terms of the meritocracy and the glory of champions that come through the system and all those emotional things, to be that kind of rocky moment, like Adrian, and those things that move us as human beings, right? What if you found out it was all a facade and it was all bullshit? And that, but you couldn't get there because you couldn't think of conspiracy because, hey, everybody that's in the mainstream wants to tell you, hey, they're smart, they sound smart, they're in nice suits, they came from Ivy League schools and they've got degrees, and hey, you can trust them. Meanwhile, it's them that created the system that's completely betrayed us all. Do you think that the people that are inside the two biggest failed banks in the country, not to mention, our financial system, don't have MBAs and don't have higher degrees, and many of them JDs, and all of the best people that are the smartest people? No, they're just fucking playing you for the fool. So don't be a tool in their full circus, man. Have some pride, have some dignity, have some courage. And this is the way I'll finish up like I always finish up. Listen to the Swifties out there, and there's no way you guys stay tuned for this whole thing. There's nobody listening to this whole thing. I don't think it's possible anybody can stay tuned for this whole thing. But I'm trying to get everybody out there who understands and it resonates to like and subscribe, to share, to invest, to buy in through just $13 for respect for the original 13 colonies that created the United States for all of its flaws. And we could debate that all day long. And call me up. And, we'll take any issue you want, but it doesn't matter. They still defeated the British Empire to create separation of powers. And what took place in the Civil War was what probably should have taken place during the Revolutionary War as well. But, this is how things go. And here we are in 2024, guys. Everything's on the line. So please, with me, rise, roar, revolt. Failure is not an option. It's not rocket science. It's racketeering. When you have the truth, you're bulletproof. This is the righteous grind for the clean New Deal. Onwards and upwards.